Another referendum that could again shake the European Union. Italians at a vote on whether or not to strengthen central government and weaken the old political guard. What happens in Rome if there's a no vote? And how would Italy and the EU be affected? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi says that his proposed reforms will streamline the Italian government, reduce bureaucracy and make it easier to pass laws. His critics say changes to the constitution will remove checks and balances and give more power to the ruling party. A no vote in Sunday's referendum will not only block Renzi's reforms but could also mean the end of his premiership. He's promised to resign if voters reject the changes. Many Italians see the referendum as an opportunity to punish the establishment. Comparisons are being made with the victory of Donald Trump in the United States and Britain's Brexit vote to leave the European Union.
If the no wins, it's clear that the country is weaker and that the economic situation is more vulnerable. It's clear that it will be harder for us. We will tackle it if the no wins. But it has to be clear that the yes will not make the government stronger. It will make Italy stronger.
Well, here's a more detailed look at Renzi's proposed reforms. He's proposing that more than 40 changes are made to the constitution. The most radical is abolishing the elected Senate, leaving most legislative powers with the lower house. Renzi is also proposing cutting the number of members of parliament to slash costs. And his plan gives the national government supremacy in most issues, making it easier to override opposition to infrastructure and other major projects. But the many critics of the proposals say that they give too much power to central government. Let's bring in our guests and get their thoughts. Joining us from Rome today, Massimo Franco, who's the political columnist for Corriere della Sera. In London, Matt Kvortrup, who's the joint editor of European Political Science Review. He's also the author of Referendums Around the World and Referendums and Ethnic Conflict. And joining us via Skype from Milan, Alan Friedman, a journalist and author of Berlusconi, the epic story of the billionaire who took over Italy. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Let's start with you, Massimo. Will people vote in this referendum because they genuinely want to say on constitutional reform in Italy, or just because they want to kick the establishment?
Well, I think that the vote will be a very messy affair, because I think that every front has quite exaggerated the meaning. So I think that most of the people do not know exactly what is at stake. I think that there are different positions. I think that, of course, Beppe Grillo wants to kick the government out, but I also think that for the government it's a problem of the original sin of Renzi, who has never been elected. So he tries to obtain a legitimacy from this vote because he didn't get from the polls in the past.
Alan Friedman in Milan, a very messy affair then this is going to be. Is the vote a plebiscite on Matteo Renzi's leadership?
Yeah, I think we have to put this in perspective. We're talking about a nation that's divided. The Italians are pretty much 50-50 in favor of and against the referendum. But while the referendum itself is about streamlining the parliament and doing some good things like making it faster to pass budget laws, and some bad things like a messy Senate that's not elected, it's gone beyond the Constitution. This is a referendum about Renzi. He's personalized it himself. He said he would resign if he lost, then he took that back. There's no doubt that what we're looking at is the question of whether the Trump effect and the Brexit effect of a wave of populism and anti-establishment politics will cause the no vote to triumph as a vote of protest against Renzi. That's where we're going.
Alan, that's something I want to explore a little further, a little later in the programme. But for the moment, I want to ask you, what has tarnished Renzi's demolition man image? I mean, he came to power saying that he was going to stand up to Brussels, he was going to reform the country, and yet his popularity has plummeted. What's gone wrong?
Well, you could say that the Italians are impatient for economic recovery. Renzi has been in office nearly 3 years. He's done the right things. He started the Jobs Act. He's started to reform welfare. But Italy is a really tough country to reform. So a lot of dark forces are pushing back against him. And he has lost popularity because there's been a migration crisis. Remember, Italy bears the brunt of the migration crisis in Southern Europe, and the Germans don't seem to be very sympathetic. And also because the economic recovery has not been enough to make Italians have the feel-good factor. They still feel poor, they still feel like they're in recession, and they're impatient and they don't believe in Renzi's reforms anymore.
Let's bring in Matt Quarterup then in London. Matt, do referendums work? Do they oversimplify politics and merely act as a political tool?
I think they can act as a political tool, but that's normally because of the political elite who call the referendums. David Cameron didn't need to call a referendum. He did that for party tactical purposes and he lost that. I think referendums tend to work. The British people who voted in the referendum here roughly knew what they were talking about. You don't need to have encyclopedic knowledge to vote in a referendum. You just need to know the main points, just like elected politicians don't have encyclopedic knowledge of all the laws that they vote on. So referendums are a rough indicator of the direction that people want to go in. And if you have a political party that proposes reform that is not supported by the majority of the people, especially if it's a constitutional reform about the rules of the game and you don't have the support of a vast majority, then you stand a chance of losing or a risk of losing, which is what happened with Charles de Gaulle. By all accounts, one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, the French president. He proposed a referendum in 1969. He said, if I don't win, I will resign. And people gave him a good kicking because they didn't like the reform proposals that would be put before them. So generally speaking, referendums work quite well. People are able to make up their minds on relatively accurate knowledge. But what is also interesting is that if we look at the roughly 300 or so referendums we've had in European history, there's only been a handful of those that have led to the resignation of a government. So most referendums, for example, when Jacques Chirac lost in France in 2005, he did not resign. And we've had only a few examples of governments that have resigned as a result of a referendum.
Okay, Matt,
so Renzi has...
I was going to ask you how enthusiastic you think the Italians will be about voting in this. I mean, sure, if they want to make a political point, but Italians, perhaps more than most people in Europe, have been required to vote more often than many others. I mean, what sort of turnout do you think we're going to expect in this referendum tomorrow?
Well, in many referendums we've had citizen-initiated referendums, and often they have failed because the turnout has been below 50%, which was a requirement in these other referendums. So I think we could potentially get a low turnout, though in this particular case it will depend very much on all the other factors, especially that Renzi has said that he will resign or not resign, then he comes back and says he'll resign again, a little bit unclear. But the fact that he puts his neck on the line might mean that a lot of people will turn out to vote, not because there's so much interest in the referendum, but because Renzi himself has made this a referendum on himself.
Okay, I can see Alan agreeing and disagreeing with some of what you want to say, but first let's go to Massimo once again. Forget for a moment, Massimo, the wanting to give perhaps the establishment, the government, a kick. Do Renzi's proposed reforms fail to address Italy's deep-seated economic problems, as some people have argued? Are they undemocratic, or are they, on the other hand, entirely sensible and logical?
Well, I think that these economic problems have been pretty exaggerated. I think that Italy will muddle through these elections, whatever the outcome. Let me also say that there are two main problems with this referendum. The first, Renzi at the very beginning thought that this referendum would have been won very swimmingly from him. So going ahead, he realized that victory was not as certain as he thought. Why? Because Renzi promised two things: to stop the five-star movement and to recover economy. These were their main tasks, and possibly he failed both. So now he understands that he risks a lot and that the economic problems are still there. I'm not sure that it's just a populist wave, because I think that the concept of populism now should be declined in a different way, because what we see today is that populism is reaching beyond traditional populists. So I think that we must not confuse populism with a wider phenomenon to be analyzed in depth.
Okay, we'll come on to populism in greater detail in just a moment. But in the last opinion poll, Massimo, 2 weeks ago, because the law doesn't allow opinion polls to be published 2 weeks up to the vote, the no camp was just a few percentage points in front. How close do you think this is going to be?
Well, I think that in the last days, the yes front recovered a bit. I don't know what the outcome will be at the very end. What I assume is that Renzi will present his resignation, but it's not a given that he will resign actually. It depends very much on the outcome of this referendum, the percentages if he would lose, and also the role of the President of the Republic, which will be a key role after the referendum.
Alan, how can a no vote be seen as a protest vote when it's basically a vote to preserve the status quo?
A no vote would be seen most of all as an anti-government vote, a vote against the existing government, and that protest vote from the populist, demagogic, xenophobic Northern League and the Five-Star Movement are part of I disagree with my colleague Massimo, are part of a European and international wave of anti-system, anti-establishment politics. What I think will happen in Italy, though, is after the vote, whether the no vote or the yes vote wins, Matteo Renzi will still be the prime minister. Whether he goes through the formality of, after a no vote, saying to the President of the Republic, shall I resign? And the President says, no, continue, or yes, but head another government, doesn't matter, because we're forgetting one important fact. Italy cannot go to a general election until it starts and writes a new election law, because Italy's current electoral law is unconstitutional. So the country not only has the risk of a referendum, but after the referendum, whoever is in charge still has to write a new election law before a vote can be held. I'm pretty sure Renzi will continue as prime minister, even if it's in a next government or a short-term government just aimed at taking the country to national elections.
Okay, well, you've heard the Five-Star Movement mentioned by both Massimo and Alan there. It has much to gain from this referendum. Opinion polls suggest that if early elections were called after a no victory, the anti-establishment Populist Party could win a big majority. But many Italians are asking whether the movement has what it takes to go from protest to government. A report now from Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull.
Take a ride in a bus on the cobbled streets of Rome and it's a bone-jarring journey. They're old, many are falling apart, some have quite literally burst into flames. When she swept to power in June, the new mayor, Virginia Raggi, promised to fix public services in a city itself often considered to be falling apart. Little has been done so far. She belongs to the grassroots anti-politics, anti-Euro Five-Star movement, possibly in contention for government at the next election if the weekend's referendum goes against Prime Minister Matteo Renzi.
They don't have a program, they don't have a political class. They have a bunch of isolated initiatives and isolated individuals. You don't govern 60 million people and an advanced industrial country with that. That's really impossible.
And that is what concerns financial markets and EU officials in Brussels about what may happen politically in Italy after Sunday's vote.
Now, it may seem unkind to judge the Five-Star Movement on the basis of Mayor Raggi's 6 months in office, but Rome is a chaotic city that requires a particular kind of political mettle. It's the best example available of what it would be like to run the country as a whole.
Just ask the previous occupant of City Hall.
It's difficult to say that she's doing a good job. I think that the fact that they took more than 6 months or almost 6 months just to put together a good team or a decent team is not a good start.
The Five-Star Movement, led by charismatic comedian Beppe Grillo, has more than 120 members of parliament, few with any background in politics. I put the critics' view that they're unable to govern to one of them.
Those who say this are our enemies. It's to be expected that they say that about us.
But are they ready to govern?
You don't govern with fear, you govern with courage. We are brave, therefore we are ready.
In pushing for a no vote on Sunday, the obvious question is why this pro-change, anti-establishment movement is supporting the constitutional status quo. The answer, perhaps, because that is the most direct route to power. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Rome.
Matt, caught up in London, is Sunday's vote in Italy the next stage in this global populist revolution, as some are calling it?
I don't think it is. I think the difference is this is not going to be an unexpected result if there is indeed a defeat for Mr. Renzi. The Brexit result, though some people had predicted it, was generally seen as a very big surprise, and certainly Donald Trump's victory in America was seen as a result of that. I think, though, one has to say that the political party, the political classes, probably have to sort of synchronize a little bit their views with the people or the voters. They might be seen as being out of touch, and I think the referendums and the elections we have seen recently are a signal to the political class that the projects and the ideas they've had about free trade, about immigration, a number of things, need to be readjusted to be in line with the majorities of the people. So I think the populism that we might be witnessing might also just be seen as a readjustment to politics. One should not forget that the word populism was first used in America in the 1890s when people were criticizing big government, inequality, and politicians that came in with a number of proposals such as antitrust legislation were initially called populists and were seen as being very, very radical, and many of their policies were then later seen to be quite normal and quite acceptable.
Massimo, if I heard you correctly, you weren't very keen on the term populist for what's going on in Italy at the moment. What would you call it? Anti-establishment? Is anti-establishment sentiment running high in Italy? What about anti-immigration? Where does the Northern League, the far-right party, fit into all of this?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that today the real novelty is that populism is reaching people who cannot be labeled as populists, as traditional populists. So it means that there is a mix of feelings against the establishment, and that labeling them just as populist might be an alibi to hide the disconnection between the elites and the people. So we should try to use different cultural categories to understand better this spreading phenomenon. That's why I said, and let me say also that I don't think that the constitutional status quo means a shortcut to the government for the five-star movement. Paradoxically, it's the opposite. If there is a no victory, the electoral law will be changed in Italy in a more proportional direction, while if there is a victory of the yes, probably there could be fresh elections with Grillo and Renzi confronting themselves, and it might become a gamble in which the five-star movement might try to get the government earlier than we think.
Alan, you made comparisons earlier between the Brexit vote in the UK, the US presidential election, Donald Trump being elected president. The confidence among business leaders, many politicians and economists in Italy, the country is going to vote yes, mirrors that we saw in the UK before Brexit and in the US. Are people going to be shocked by the result? And does a no vote mean that ultimately Italy is heading towards the exit door of the EU?
Right. No and no. I don't think that a no vote will cause a economic disaster for Italy. I think there have been exaggerated fears. I think there'll be market volatility. You might see spreads go up. You might see problems for Italian bonds for a few days or weeks. But I do not see this as destroying the Italian economy. What I do think is that the forces of no, meaning Beppe Grillo, this comedian who is a strange figure, an unknown quantity, and the Northern League, which is a crypto-racist and anti-immigrant xenophobic extremist party, these two forces will try to move forward. And I think right now for Italy, for the economy, Renzi is probably their best bet, because there doesn't seem to be any other leader of stature in the opposition who would be capable of running Italy. And I think the real problem Italy faces is its banking system is weak, and several banks need to be recapitalized very urgently. They're having trouble finding that money on the private sector and the markets. So maybe, yes or no vote, Italy will have to deal with its biggest problem after the referendum, which is recapitalizing 10 or 15 billion euros worth of banks, getting around European rules that restrict them, and trying to come up with state aid to save some banks. After that, I think I agree with Massimo and everybody. We're going to go to an election with whatever election law is written, and it's going to be essentially Renzi defending himself against Grillo and the Five Star Movement. And it's quite possible that this group of this unknown quantity, the Five Star Movement, will be the populist, demagogic, extremist, unknown quantity winner of the next election. That's possible.
Okay,
yes.
and Matt, it is Italy's precarious financial position, or at least the position of its banks at the moment, that is more of a threat, isn't it, to the Eurozone than any of the populist movements within the country right now. But, I mean, can the Eurozone and the EU ultimately survive what appears to be growing populist sentiment?
I think it can. I think in many countries these populist parties have gone into government. Finland, the True Finns, who were quite a radical party, came into government and then became more pragmatic when they came into government. Also, we have Syriza in Greece, who have in many ways implemented reforms that in some ways saved the Eurozone after, of course, they negotiated with the Germans and the French and all the rest of them last year. So I think the populist parties, again, are sending a signal. And I think what is interesting in present-day Europe, if we look at Europe in a more historical perspective, is that nowadays we have elections. We don't have violence on the streets, and that's where we can't really, or can't at all, compare this with the 1930s and the fascist movements. So I think the populist parties will have to be listened to, but they also, when they have to be taken into government. And I think the danger is if some of these parties don't want to govern, just want to sit on the sidelines and shout. For example, in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, who have dropped a little bit in the polls, is that we don't want to go into government, but we want to have the right to criticize the government. If we have these populist parties, they have to be taken into government. Okay. They have to be shown that they can lead or not lead, and that will be the solution to it.
Massimo, I have a feeling this is going to be the last answer here, but we've got the vote in Austria this weekend, which could return a right-wing president. We've got elections in France and Germany next year, in which far-right parties look set to be major contenders. I mean, this growing anti-establishment movement across Europe, what threat does it pose to the bloc?
Well, I think the main threat is that the ruling class doesn't listen to the people. So I think that the major threat is the destruction of European traditional values, and not to understand that democratic parties have to adapt to the new situation, read it correctly, and react correctly. I think that for Italy it means that we have to change the approach, because on the contrary, we might have a confrontation in next elections between two populism, the government's populism and Grillo's populism. Yeah. This is to avoid, because in this case, Italy might appear as a populist country as a whole, which is not true. So there must be a wider offer, political offer. And I think this is the same case in Europe. Although my impression is that, for instance, France tends to have found a solution to confront in a very effective way Marine Le Pen's movement.
Okay. Alan, I've got about 20 seconds to give you. I know you want to come in.
Just briefly, I think the risk in Italy, in the Austrian presidential election, in Holland with the possible election of Geert Wilders and anti-immigrant groups, is a wave of what I would call anti-immigrant populism. And I think the major risk is more racism in Europe.
Okay.
That's what we're
all right. And there we must end it, gentlemen. Many thanks indeed. Massimo Franco, Matt Kvortrup and Alan Friedman. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thank you too for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, join us on our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join our conversation at Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. See you again. Bye for now.